In 1325, two of the most powerful cities in northern Italy went to war, real armies, real people dying in muddy fields on a cold November morning. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry charges, cities put on military alert. The Pope himself, the actual Pope, tried to intervene and got completely ignored. And the reason for all of it was this: a wooden bucket from a well that someone stole. Not a magical bucket, not a bucket full of gold coins, not a bucket containing some ancient relic or secret military weapon. Just a regular, unremarkable, absolutely unimpressive wooden bucket that someone used to pull water out of a hole in the ground. And yet, because of this bucket, one of the largest battles in medieval Italian history would be fought. Thousands of men would die. And when it was all over, when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, the city that started the whole thing would walk away with nothing, except the bucket, which they put in their cathedral tower, where it still sits today, 700 years later. This is the War of the Bucket, and it is simultaneously the most absurd, the most embarrassing, and the most perfectly Italian thing that has ever happened in the entire history of human conflict. Let's go. To understand why two cities went to war over a bucket, you first need to understand one very important thing about medieval Italy in the 1300s. It was an absolute, spectacular, magnificent disaster. Not in a quiet, slow-burning kind of way. In a loud, dramatic, everyone has a personal vendetta, someone is always on fire kind of way. See, while the rest of Europe, at least, had the basic courtesy of organizing itself into kingdoms with kings and borders that mostly made sense, Italy in the 1300s looked less like a country and more like a group project where everyone refused to cooperate. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of city-states, each one convinced it was the most important place on earth, each one willing to go to absolutely unreasonable lengths to prove it. Florence hated Siena. Venice was suspicious of everyone. Milan was doing whatever Milan does when no one is watching. And scattered across the whole mess were dozens of smaller cities, all jostling for trade, territory, and the right to feel superior. It was, in short, perfect chaos. But even within this chaos, there was a deeper layer of madness, a second tier of disaster sitting underneath the first one. And that disaster had a name: the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Now, deep breath. I'm going to explain this as fast as possible because we could spend an entire separate video on just this topic and still not fully cover it. For roughly 2 centuries, from around the 1100s all the way to the 1300s, the Italian peninsula was divided between two massive political factions: the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor, the big secular power broker of medieval Europe, whose empire covered most of Germany and chunks of Italy. The Guelphs supported the Pope, the big religious power broker sitting in Rome, who had strong opinions about basically everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Now on paper, that sounds like a clear ideological divide. Pope's team versus Emperor's team. Easy enough. In practice, it was a complete nightmare because cities switched sides constantly depending on who was winning, who they were currently angry at, and who had most recently stabbed them in the back during a trade negotiation. The labels Guelph and Ghibelline stopped being about the Pope and the Emperor almost immediately and became tribal identities. Something closer to sports team loyalty, except instead of losing a match, you lost your head. The result was 2 solid centuries of wars, citywide purges, mass exiles, and an atmosphere of permanent political paranoia across the entire peninsula. And right in the middle of this mess, sandwiched between all of this chaos, sat 2 cities who absolutely despised each other: Bologna and Modena. Bologna was a Guelph city, large, wealthy, culturally confident, and home to the University of Bologna, the oldest university in the entire world, founded in 1088. A fact Bolognese people have never once let anyone forget. Bologna was the kind of city that wore its importance like a very expensive coat and expected everyone around it to notice. Modena was a Ghibelline city, smaller than Bologna, less wealthy than Bologna, strategically positioned on the Via Emilia, the old Roman road that cut straight across northern Italy and was basically a highway for trade. Modena was scrappier than its neighbor, more combative, and absolutely sick of Bologna acting like the dominant power in the region. These two cities shared a border, which meant they shared everything that comes with a border. Disputed territory, trade conflicts, rivers that neither side could agree on the ownership of, refugees crossing in both directions, and a century of accumulated resentment that had never once been fully resolved. By 1325, the relationship between Bologna and Modena was essentially two neighbors who had been in a Cold War for so long that neither side could entirely remember how it started. They weren't actively at war, but they weren't at peace either. They were at that very specific medieval Italian version of hostility where everyone is technically behaving themselves while waiting for an excuse to stop. They would not have to wait much longer. The exact details of what happened next depend on which medieval chronicle you read. And medieval chronicles, I should warn you, were written by people with very strong opinions about who the good guys were. But the general shape of events goes something like this. At some point in 1325, the precise date is lost to history. A group of Modenese soldiers crossed into Bolognese territory on what was probably a small raid. Border raids between these two cities were not unusual. They happened. They were annoying. They were the medieval equivalent of your neighbor parking slightly too far into your driveway. Technically a violation. Deeply irritating. Usually not worth escalating over. But on this particular raid, something happened that crossed a line. On their way out of Bolognese territory, one of the Modenese soldiers spotted a wooden bucket sitting on the edge of a well in the town square. And he grabbed it, not for any tactical reason, not because it was valuable, not because anyone ordered him to. He grabbed it as a trophy, as a taunt, as a very petty, very Italian way of saying, we were here, you couldn't stop us, and we're taking your bucket as a souvenir. The soldiers brought the bucket back to Modena. It probably got passed around. People laughed, someone hung it on a wall somewhere. It was a joke, a funny little provocation designed to annoy their neighbors. And in Bologna, when word spread of what had happened, the mood was not amused. Now, a reasonable person at this point says, it's a bucket. It's a bucket. You have a university, you have one of the most sophisticated cities in northern Italy. You have trade networks, walls, a functioning government, and surely more important things to worry about than a bucket from a well. Bologna was not feeling reasonable. Here's the thing you need to understand. The bucket wasn't really about the bucket. It was never about the bucket. The bucket was about every trade dispute that had never been settled, every border that had been contested, every time Modena had encroached on Bolognese territory and gotten away with it. The bucket was 100 years of resentment finally having a shape. It was the match, and the powder keg had been sitting there for a very, very long time. Bologna sent a formal delegation to Modena, official representatives, diplomatic language, the whole procedure. The message was simple: give back the bucket. Modena's response was equally simple: no. Bologna said, we will go to war over this. Modena said, okay. And just like that, the most embarrassing war in the history of medieval Europe was officially on. Now here is where the story stops being merely funny and becomes genuinely, historically insane. Because Bologna's response to the theft of one wooden bucket was not a strongly worded letter. It was not a diplomatic ultimatum. It was not even a small punitive raid designed to make a point. Bologna assembled an army of approximately 30,000 men. 30,000 men for a bucket. Let me put that number in perspective for you, because I want you to really feel what 30,000 medieval soldiers look like. The Battle of Agincourt, probably the most famous battle of the 100 Years' War, the one everyone knows, the one Shakespeare wrote a play about, involved roughly 13,000 soldiers combined on both sides. Bologna was preparing to deploy more than twice the total force of Agincourt to retrieve a piece of wood from a well in a neighboring city. The coalition Bologna assembled included not just its own forces, but allies from the broader Guelph network across northern Italy. Cities that shared Bologna's political alignment, cities that had their own grievances against Ghibelline Modena, cities that saw this as an opportunity to deal a decisive blow to the other side of the faction divide. This was no longer about a bucket. This was the Guelph-Ghibelline Cold War finally boiling over, and the bucket was just the excuse everyone had been waiting for. Before the armies even left their cities, something remarkable happened. The Pope tried to stop it. Pope John the 22nd sitting in Avignon, France, because the papacy had relocated there a few years earlier in its own spectacular drama, received word of what was happening in northern Italy. A massive army assembling over a bucket, he dispatched official papal envoys to both cities, real representatives carrying the full weight of papal authority. The message was essentially, "Gentlemen, we are begging you. It is a bucket. Please, think about what you are doing." Bologna said, "We want our bucket back." Modena said, "We are keeping the bucket." The Pope's envoys went home. The Pope had been completely ignored by both sides. Over a bucket in 1325. Let that sink in. By November of 1325, Bologna's enormous coalition force was on the move. 30,000 soldiers marching across the flat Po Valley of northern Italy toward Modena, which sat about 40 kilometers to the west. And in Modena, the people watching this army approach from the city walls were doing some very uncomfortable math. Modena was smaller. Modena's army was smaller. By any conventional military analysis, Modena was about to get absolutely steamrolled by a force multiple times its size. The sensible thing, the rational thing, would have been to negotiate, to give back the bucket, to find some face-saving formula that let everyone go home without anyone dying. Modena did not give back the bucket. Instead, Modena prepared to fight. And here's where the story introduces one of the most important characters in this whole drama, a man named Passerino Bonacolsi. Passerino Bonacolsi was the Lord of Modena, technically the Podesta, the chief magistrate, but in practical terms, the man who ran everything. He was experienced, politically shrewd, and most importantly, he was a tactician who understood something crucial about his situation. Numbers are not everything. Passerino had one significant military advantage, that Bologna's massive army could not easily counter: cavalry. Fast, mobile, disciplined cavalry units that could move quickly across the flat terrain of the Po Valley. And he had a very specific idea about how to use them. He was not going to wait behind his walls and hope the siege went well. He was going to come out and fight, and he was going to fight smart. On the 15th of November, 1325, the two forces met near the village of Zappolino, a small settlement roughly halfway between the two cities in the flat agricultural land of the Po Valley that stretched in every direction with almost no cover. The Battle of Zappolino. On one side, 30,000 Guelph soldiers, enormous, well-equipped, absolutely furious about a bucket. On the other side, the Modenese force and their Ghibelline allies, significantly smaller but organized, and led by a man who had a plan. Bologna's army had numbers, but 30,000 men in the 14th century is not a precision instrument. It's a flood. It's loud, it's slow, it takes enormous effort to coordinate, and when individual units lose contact with central command, which happens constantly in medieval battles, the whole structure starts to wobble. Passerino knew this. He targeted the wobble. His cavalry hit the Bolognese flanks. The edges of the formation, where coordination was weakest, where orders from the center arrived slowest, where individual units were most likely to make bad decisions when suddenly under pressure from fast-moving horsemen coming at them from unexpected angles. The Bolognese formation, which had looked invincible on paper, started to crack at the edges. Units that couldn't see what was happening to their neighbors began pulling back. Commanders lost contact. The size of the army, which was supposed to be the decisive advantage, became the decisive liability because there were simply too many men in too small a space trying to respond to threats from too many directions at once. The collapse, when it came, was fast. By the time the sun began to drop toward the flat western horizon of the Po Valley, Bologna's great army was in retreat. Units fragmenting, men streaming back toward the city in disorder. The dream of a decisive, humiliating victory over Modena, the army that would march in, take back the bucket, and make clear once and for all who the dominant power in this region was, had turned into a nightmare. The final death toll varies, depending on which chronicle you consult. Medieval record keeping is not exactly rigorous, but estimates range from 2,000 to 4,000 soldiers dead at Zappolino. Real people, real deaths, fathers, sons, brothers, all of them gone, because someone grabbed a bucket off a well, and nobody on either side had the wisdom to just let it go. Passerino Bonacolsi marched his victorious army back to Modena with the bucket. Bologna, humiliated beyond anything it had expected, tried to regroup. In the weeks that followed, Modena's victory was complete enough that they could afford to push further, raiding Bolognese territory, extracting maximum humiliation from their stunned and demoralized neighbor. Bologna had marched out with 30,000 men to make a point. The point Modena made in return was significantly louder. Eventually, the immediate military campaign wound down. peace negotiations began. Emissaries shuttled back and forth. Agreements were discussed. And in every single one of those negotiations, Bologna asked for the bucket back. And in every single one of those negotiations, Modena said no. Because here's the thing about medieval Italian civic pride. It cannot be overstated. It cannot be rationalized with. And it definitely cannot be negotiated away when you have just won one of the most lopsided, upset victories anyone in the region can remember. Modena took that bucket and put it in the Ghirlandina Tower, the tall, elegant bell tower attached to Modena's cathedral, visible from half the city. The most prominent architectural symbol of Modenese identity that existed. They put it up there like it was a battle standard, like it was a piece of the true cross, like it was the single most important object Modena had ever possessed, which in a very real sense it was. Not because it was a bucket, but because of what it represented. A smaller city, a supposedly weaker city, a city that everyone expected to fold when the big army came marching down the road. That city had stood its ground, fought back, and won. And the bucket was proof. Bologna would not see their bucket again. So what happened after all of this? The honest answer is not that much, at least not immediately. The Guelph-Ghibelline conflict continued to simmer across northern Italy for another generation before eventually dissolving into new configurations of power and rivalry that made the original factions almost irrelevant. Bologna and Modena continued their awkward coexistence, still neighbors, still suspicious of each other, still arguing over borders and trade routes, but never quite reaching the fever pitch of 1325 again. No major territorial changes resulted from the War of the Bucket. No borders were redrawn, no city changed hands, no political system was transformed. The war settled nothing except the one question that had started it. Who gets the bucket? Modena. Modena gets the bucket. Forever. And that was that. Here is the part that I need you to appreciate fully because it is one of my favorite facts in this entire story. The bucket still exists. Right now, today, in the year 2025, there is a bucket in Modena. It is displayed in the Palazzo Comunale, Modena's town hall. The one you can see in the Ghirlandina Tower is a replica because the original is too historically significant to leave exposed to the elements 7 centuries after the fact. But it is there, carefully preserved, still intact. A wooden bucket that survived the 1300s, the Black Death, the Renaissance, the wars of Italian unification, 2 world wars, and several centuries of Italian bureaucracy, which honestly might be the most impressive part. It has outlasted every single person who fought and died over it. It has outlasted the political factions, the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, that made it matter. It has outlasted the entire medieval world that produced it. Modena has had this bucket for 700 years. Bologna has never gotten it back, not once. Not through negotiation, not through later conflicts, not through any diplomatic channel. In 7 centuries of history, the bucket won. But here is the real question, the one worth actually sitting with. Was this war really about a bucket? Obviously not. You know that, I know that. Even the people fighting it probably knew that on some level. The bucket was never the point. The bucket was the shape that all the other points finally took. Think about what was actually underneath that war. 200 years of Guelph-Ghibelline rivalry, turning every border dispute into an ideological confrontation. A century of accumulated grievances between Bologna and Modena that had never been resolved through dialogue, because dialogue in 14th century Italy was mostly done through armies, trade routes that both cities needed and neither wanted to share, border territories that were always slightly ambiguous and always slightly contested. And sitting on top of all of that, a culture of civic pride so fierce and so deeply embedded that to be publicly humiliated by your neighbor, even over something as trivial as a bucket, was not something you could let pass without a response. The bucket was just the excuse. Just the moment when all that pressure finally had a direction to go. And that is the uncomfortable truth about how a lot of wars actually start. Rarely is it the thing itself. Rarely does a nation or a city mobilize because of the literal object at the center of the dispute. It's everything that came before. It's the century of bad blood. It's the trade war nobody resolved. It's the border incident from 30 years ago that everyone officially forgave and nobody actually forgot. It's the grievance that compresses and compresses under the surface until one day someone steals a bucket and suddenly 30,000 men are standing in a field. The next time you read about a war that started over something that seems absurdly small, an assassination in a street in Sarajevo, a border skirmish in a disputed zone, a ship that was stopped in the wrong harbor, remember Bologna. Remember the bucket. It's never really about the bucket. It's about everything that made the bucket matter. Somewhere in Modena right now, there is a bucket bucket. It's not doing anything impressive. It's just sitting in a display case in a town hall. Tourists walk past it. Locals probably don't even notice it anymore. It doesn't know that thousands of men died in a field because of it. It doesn't know that the Pope personally tried to intervene on its behalf. It doesn't know it's been the most famous piece of wood in Italian history for 700 years. It's just a bucket, but it's Modena's bucket. And Bologna, I'm sorry, I really am. But you're not getting it back. And if you want to know what happened to the rest of medieval Italy after this whole mess, the plague that arrived 20 years later and killed a third of the continent, the Renaissance that somehow rose from those ashes, and the chaos that never really stopped, subscribe, because we are absolutely not done with Italy. See you in the next one.